Tonight we're separating what the Bible actually says from what later tradition imagined.
God made the first human being from the ground. That is not metaphor. That is the literal text of Genesis chapter 2, verse 7. The Lord God formed the man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. Dust of the ground. The Hebrew word for the man is Adam. The Hebrew word for ground is adamah. They share the same root. Adam is a ground creature, a soil creature, a creature whose very name is an etymology of the earth he came from. And here is what your Sunday school teacher never told you, what your illustrated children's Bible never showed you, what 500 years of European religious art systematically hid from you. The ground that Adam came from. The specific soil that God scooped up and shaped into the first human body was African soil. Dark, rich, iron-saturated, red clay African soil. The oldest human fossils ever discovered sit in Ethiopia, in Kenya, in Morocco, in Tanzania. The genetic mother of every human being alive today, the woman scientists literally named Mitochondrial Eve, lived in sub-Saharan Africa between 100,000 and 200,000 years ago. The genetic father of every man on earth, the man scientist named Y-Chromosomal Adam, also lived in Africa. Science and scripture are not fighting each other on this one. They are both pointing at the same continent, at the same dark soil, at the same dark people, and saying, this is where it started. Everything else, every other skin tone, every other hair texture, every other population on the face of the earth came from that original African starting point. White skin is not the original. It is the edit. Black is the manuscript. And tonight we are going to prove it from the Bible, from genetics, from physics, from linguistics, from every angle available to us, until the only question left is why you were never told this in church. Let's start with the name, because the name is the confession. Adam, in Hebrew it is spelled Aleph, Dalet, Mem, and it comes from a root that carries multiple interconnected meanings that the English translation has almost entirely collapsed. The word Adam is related to Adam, which means red or ruddy, referring to the reddish-brown color of the ground. It is related to adamah, which means earth, soil, ground, specifically the kind of fertile reddish clay soil that characterizes the African Rift Valley and the ancient Near East. The man's name is literally a description of what he was made from and what color that material was. He was red clay man, ground man, soil man. The theological point is that Adam's identity is inseparable from his material origin, that humanity is fundamentally a creature of the earth, dependent on the ground for life. But the linguistic point, the point that sits beneath the theology and holds it up, is that the redness of the name, the redness of the soil, the redness of the raw material God used, is a color description. Dark reddish-brown clay is not pale. Dark reddish-brown clay is not the color of the skin tones painted on Adam in European Christian art. Dark reddish-brown clay is the color of the African soil that the Rift Valley sits on, that the oldest human fossils are buried in, that the genetic evidence says the original human population emerged from. The name Adam is not racially neutral. It is a description of a man made from dark African earth, who therefore looked like the earth he came from. Now bring in the science, because this is where it becomes inarguable. The out of Africa theory, also called the recent African origin model, is the consensus position of modern genetics, paleoanthropology, and evolutionary biology. It holds that anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, originated in Africa, and that all non-African populations descend from a single migration out of Africa that occurred somewhere between 50,000 and 70,000 years ago. This is not a fringe hypothesis. This is not a contested academic position. It is supported by the convergence of genetic evidence from nuclear DNA, mitochondrial DNA, Y-chromosome analysis, ancient DNA recovered from fossil remains, and the fossil record itself. The oldest Homo sapiens fossils ever found, 300,000-year-old remains from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, are African. The next oldest, around 195,000 years old, are from Homo Kibish in Ethiopia. The oldest fossils outside Africa, with clear Homo sapiens morphology, are younger than these by tens of thousands of years. The human fossil record begins in Africa, stays in Africa for the vast majority of its duration, and then disperses outward in a pattern that leaves a clear genetic trail. Every population outside Africa carries a subset of the genetic diversity found within Africa. Africa contains all the genetic diversity of the rest of the world combined, plus more. That is the genetic signature of origin. That is what origin looks like in the DNA record. Humanity began in Africa. The first human beings were African. That is the scientific consensus, and it has been the scientific consensus for decades. Mitochondrial Eve is the name geneticists gave to the most recent common matrilineal ancestor of all living humans. She is the woman from whom all mitochondrial DNA on Earth descends in an unbroken maternal line. She lived in Africa. The date estimates have varied across studies ranging from around 100,000 to 200,000 years ago, but the geography has never been in serious doubt in the mainstream scientific literature. She was African. Now the name Eve is loaded, and scientists are careful to explain that mitochondrial Eve was not the only woman alive in her time, just as the biblical Eve was not necessarily the only woman, and that the name is a convenient label for a genetic concept rather than a direct identification with the biblical figure. But here's what matters for our purposes tonight. The woman science labels with the name of the biblical first woman was black. She lived in sub-Saharan Africa. She had dark skin because every human being living in equatorial Africa 150,000 years ago had dark skin, because dark skin is the biological requirement for survival under the ultraviolet radiation of the African equatorial sun, and light skin had not yet appeared in any human population. Mitochondrial Eve was a black African woman. If you believe the Bible and you believe the science, both of them point their finger at the same place and describe the same person. The mother of all the living was a black woman in Africa. Y-chromosomal Adam is the corresponding figure on the paternal line, the most recent common patrilineal ancestor of all men alive today. He also lived in Africa. Multiple independent studies, using different methodologies, have reached similar conclusions about his African origin, with date estimates ranging from around 200,000 to 340,000 years ago for the deepest branches. The specific region of Africa most commonly identified in the genetic literature for the deepest human Y-chromosome diversity is sub-Saharan Africa, particularly the southern African sand population, which carries some of the oldest genetic lineages on Earth. The man science calls Adam the genetic patriarch of the entire male human population was a dark-skinned man living in Africa. He was not white. He could not have been white. White skin did not exist yet. The mutations that reduce melanin production and result in pale skin arose much later in human history, in populations that had migrated far from the equatorial African sun into the low ultraviolet environments of northern Europe, where the selective pressure ran in the opposite direction, and darker skin was actually a disadvantage because it blocked too much of the sunlight needed to synthesize. Vitamin D white skin is a specific adaptation to a specific environment. It is a derived trait, which is the technical genetic term for a characteristic that developed later from an original ancestral state. The ancestral state, the original condition, the default human setting is dark skin. Adam and Eve were dark. Everything else is downstream. Here is the physics of it, and it is not complicated. Human skin color is determined primarily by melanin, a pigment produced by specialized cells called melanocytes. Melanin comes in two main forms: eumelanin, which is dark brown to black, and pheomelanin, which is reddish to yellow. Dark-skinned people produce more eumelanin. Light-skinned people produce less. The crucial fact is that the genes that produce melanin are ancient. They were present in our primate ancestors long before Homo sapiens appeared. They are conserved across species. The ancestral human condition is melanin production, dark skin, not the relative absence of melanin that characterizes light skin. Light skin in human populations is caused by specific mutations in specific genes. SLC24A5, SLC45A2, MC1R, OCA2, and others that reduce melanin synthesis. These are loss of function variants, meaning they work by turning something down or off, not by adding something new. Pale skin in European populations is the result of multiple independent mutations, accumulating over tens of thousands of years of life at high latitudes with low ultraviolet radiation, where the selective pressure against these mutations was absent or reversed. The original human skin was dark because the original human environment was equatorial Africa, where ultraviolet radiation is intense year-round, where melanin is not an aesthetic preference, but a biological requirement for protecting the DNA in skin cells from radiation damage that causes cancer. God made a human body that was designed to survive in the environment it was placed in. He placed it in Africa. Africa requires dark skin. Adam and Eve had dark skin. The biology is not ambiguous on this point. Go back to Genesis chapter 2 and read the geography of Eden, because the text is more specific than most readings acknowledge, and the specificity points at Africa in ways that the church has been stepping over for centuries. Verses 10 through 14 describe 4 rivers flowing out of Eden. 2 of them are the Tigris and Euphrates, which are identifiable as the rivers of Mesopotamia, modern Iraq. The traditional location of Eden has therefore been placed in the ancient Near East, which is not unreasonable as far as it goes. But 2 other rivers are named, Pishon and Gihon. The Gihon is described in verse 13 as the one that winds through the entire land of Cush. Cush, that is not a minor detail. Cush, in the Hebrew Bible, is the name for the African territory south of Egypt, encompassing what we now call Sudan, Ethiopia, and parts of the Horn of Africa. Cush is Africa. The land of Cush is definitively, consistently, throughout the entire Hebrew Bible, an African territory. Its people are described as dark-skinned in multiple passages. Jeremiah 13:23 uses the skin of the Cushite as a fixed, unchangeable characteristic, the same way it uses the spots of a leopard as a natural permanent feature of identity. Numbers 12 records that Moses married a Cushite woman, a woman from Africa. One of the rivers of Eden winds through the entire land of Cush, through Africa. Eden is not a garden sitting somewhere in Iraq that has an African tributary. Eden is a garden with a river that flows through the whole of Africa. The Garden of God in the biblical description has African geography embedded in its very landscape. Adam and Eve were placed in a garden with an African river running through it. The ancient Near Eastern world in which the writers of Genesis lived understood the land of Cush as the legendary land of abundance, the source of gold and precious stones, the richly endowed territory at the edge of the known world where the most valuable things came from. Genesis 2:12 describes the land of Havilah, through which the Pishon flows, as a place where gold is found, good gold, and also bdellium and onyx stone. These are descriptions of territory associated with African and Arabian riches, the same trade commodities that appear in descriptions of ancient African kingdoms throughout the Hebrew Bible. The Garden of Eden, in its biblical description, is a garden of extraordinary abundance, surrounded by rivers that touch African geography, rich in the kinds of resources that the ancient world associated with Africa and the Arabian corridor adjacent to Africa. This is not a Scandinavian landscape. This is not a northern European temperate zone. The geography of Genesis 2 places the first human beings in a landscape that has African geography as one of its defining features. The first humans lived in or near Africa in the biblical account, just as they lived in Africa in the scientific account. And they would have looked like the people who have always lived in Africa. Dark, warm-toned, melanin-rich, designed by God for the environment they inhabited. Now let's look at the earliest human civilizations that emerge after the Eden narrative and track what they look like, because the Bible's own history of early humanity is relentlessly African in its geography and its people. Genesis chapter 10, known as the Table of Nations, is the first ethnographic map in human history. It organizes the nations of the ancient world into 3 genealogical lines descending from Noah's 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham is explicitly described as the ancestor of Cush, of Egypt, of Put, and of Canaan. Cush, we have already established, is African. Egypt is Africa. Put is Africa, identified with Libya or Somalia, depending on the scholar. So Ham, one of Noah's 3 sons, one of 3 survivors of the flood event in the biblical narrative, is the direct ancestor of the African nations. The first civilizations to emerge in the biblical table of nations are African ones. Egypt is named as Ham's son. That means Egypt is African in biblical genealogy, which tracks with everything we know historically and archaeologically. Because Egypt is in Africa, its people were African, its pharaohs were African, its culture was African, and the idea that ancient Egypt was populated by people who looked anything like the modern Western imagination of ancient Egypt is a fantasy constructed by the same forces that painted Adam and Eve white. Ham's descendants built the first great civilizations of the ancient world. African people built civilization first. The Bible says this. The archaeology says this. The only thing that contradicts it is 500 years of European art and Hollywood film. Nimrod, described in Genesis 10:8 as the first great warrior on earth, the founder of cities, including Babylon and Nineveh, the builder of the first empire in human history, is identified as the son of Cush, the son of Africa. The first empire builder in the biblical record was an African man, grandson of Ham, great-grandson of Noah. Nimrod built Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar, and then went to Assyria and built Nineveh and other great cities. The first person in the Bible described as a mighty hunter before the Lord. The first person identified as an empire builder. The first person to organize human political power into something that looks like a state was a man whose grandfather was the biblical ancestor of Africa. The political history of humanity in the biblical narrative begins with an African descendant. Add this to the fact that the Garden of Eden has an African river, that Adam's name is connected to dark soil, that the genetic evidence points to Africa as the origin of the human species, and a pattern emerges that is so consistent it cannot be coincidental. The Bible is telling an African origin story. It has always been telling an African origin story. The African erasure from that story was performed by people who came along later and needed the story to say something different. The image of God question sits at the center of all of this, and it is the most theologically explosive dimension of the argument. Genesis 1:27 states, God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. This is the foundational statement of human dignity in the entire Abrahamic tradition. Every human being is made in the image of God, the Imago Dei, and that divine image is the basis of human equality, human rights, human worth. Now, if Adam and Eve were black, if the first human beings created in the image of God were dark-skinned African people, then the image of God is initially expressed in black flesh. The first faces that bore the image of divinity were African faces. And here's the implication that has terrified European Christian power structures since the moment they encountered African people. If God's image was first manifest in black skin, then the people who look most like the original expression of God's image in humanity are African people. Not because black people are more divine than others, but because the original template, the first instantiation of the Imago Dei in physical human form, was dark. This does not make pale skin less image-bearing. All humans bear the image after all. But it does make the original form, the first form, the form God chose when he decided to make a creature in his own image, an African form. And that truth, sitting in the first chapter of Genesis, was so threatening to the theology of racial hierarchy that it required 500 years of artistic and theological effort to suppress it. Think about what melanin actually is and what it does. Because when you understand what God built into the original human body and why, the argument that Adam was dark becomes not just historically supported, but theologically logical. Melanin is not merely a pigment. It is a complex biopolymer that performs multiple biological functions that scientists are still fully mapping. Yes, it absorbs ultraviolet radiation and protects the DNA in skin cells from photo damage. But research over the last several decades has revealed additional properties that make melanin look less like a sunscreen and more like a sophisticated multifunctional biological system. Melanin has semiconducting properties, meaning it can conduct electricity in a regulated way. It has antioxidant properties, neutralizing free radicals that damage cells. It has the capacity to absorb a broad spectrum of electromagnetic radiation, not just ultraviolet, but also visible and infrared light. Some researchers have described melanin as having energy transducing properties, meaning it may be capable of converting absorbed light energy into chemical energy, though this research is still developing and contested. What is not contested is that melanin is ancient, that it appears in organisms far down the evolutionary tree, that it serves critical biological functions, and that the human body produces it in greatest abundance in the populations living closest to the equatorial sun in Africa. God did not give African people dark skin as a curse or as a mark of inferiority. He gave it to them as equipment, as protection, as the biological suit designed to survive in the environment he placed the first human beings in. Melanin is original equipment on the human body. Its reduction in other populations is the adaptation. The factory setting is dark. The Garden of Eden, as described in Genesis, was a place of extraordinary biological richness. Rivers, trees, fruit, gold, precious stones, abundant life. The environment God designed for the first human beings was warm, wet, biodiverse, sunlit. That description maps onto tropical and subtropical Africa. It does not map onto Northern Europe. A human body designed for the Garden of Eden, designed for abundant sunlight and rich biological diversity near the equator, would be a dark-skinned body, because dark skin is what the equatorial solar environment requires for dawn protection. A pale-skinned human being placed in the unfiltered equatorial sun of the African Rift Valley, where the oldest human fossils are found, would experience severe sunburn within hours, skin cancer within years, and would face serious reproductive disadvantage from the DNA damage that ultraviolet radiation causes to reproductive cells. Pale skin in the Garden of Eden, located in or adjacent to Africa, with African rivers, in the warm, sunlit environment the text describes, is biologically incompatible with survival. The God who made the human body also made the sun, and knew exactly what wavelengths would hit the skin of the first humans. He designed a body with sufficient melanin to survive in the environment he placed it in. That is not theology. That is physics. And the physics says Adam was dark. Now let's address the Cain and Abel story, because it contains a geographic detail that most preachers skip over completely. After Cain kills Abel and is expelled from the presence of God, Genesis 4:16 tells you that Cain went out from the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. He then builds a city named after his son Enoch, and the genealogy of his descendants follows. Then verse 17 tells you that Cain knew his wife. His wife. Where did she come from? The common answer is that she was his sister, another child of Adam and Eve, since the text has only described Cain and Abel as children so far. But the geographic detail matters. Cain goes east of Eden into the land of Nod and finds a wife there. If Eden has African rivers running through it, if the geography of Eden touches or includes African territory, then east of Eden in the ancient Near Eastern geographic imagination would include the Arabian Peninsula and the Near East. But the narrative implies an existing population in Nod that Cain accesses. The point here is not to resolve all the interpretive questions about the Cain narrative, but to observe that the story of early humanity in Genesis unfolds in a geographic zone that consistently touches African territory, that the population it describes is operating in a landscape with African rivers and African adjacent geography, and that the genetic evidence says that the populations who dispersed from Africa into the Arabian Peninsula and the Near East carried the dark pigmentation of their African ancestors with them. The human populations of the ancient Near East and the era the Genesis narrative is describing were not pale-skinned in any modern European sense. They were brown and dark-complexioned people in the same general phenotypic range as the African ancestors they had recently descended from. The Noah story brings us back to Africa again, because the Table of Nations in Genesis 10 is the Bible's own account of how the human population diversified and spread after the flood. And in that account, Africa is first. Ham's children are listed before the children of Shem and Japheth in some readings, and Ham's children include the founders of the most powerful ancient civilizations. We have already mentioned Egypt and Cush. But there is also the detail in Genesis 9 that has been most grotesquely misused in Christian history, the so-called curse of Ham. Genesis 9:27 records that Noah became drunk, lay uncovered in his tent, and that Ham saw his nakedness and told his brothers. When Noah awoke and learned what Ham had done, he cursed not Ham, but Ham's son Canaan, saying that Canaan would be the servant of servants to his brothers Shem and Japheth. This passage, for centuries, was deployed by European Christian theologians and slaveholders as a biblical justification for the enslavement of African people. The argument was that Ham was the ancestor of Africans, that God had cursed Ham's descendants to servitude, and that the transatlantic slave trade was therefore divinely ordained. This interpretation is theological malpractice of the highest order, and it has been systematically dismantled by serious biblical scholars for at least 2 centuries. The curse in the text is on Canaan, not Ham. Canaan's descendants, the Canaanite peoples of the ancient Near East, are not identified anywhere in the Bible with sub-Saharan Africa. The text says nothing about skin color. It says nothing about the African continent as a whole. It addresses a specific conflict between Noah and a specific grandson, and has nothing to do with the racial ideology that was later grafted onto it. The curse of Ham interpretation was invented not from the text, but from the theological needs of a slaving civilization that needed God's endorsement and bent the scripture until it gave them something they could use. The actual text of Genesis treats Ham and his descendants as founders of great civilizations, as Nimrod, the great builder, as Egypt, the greatest civilization of the ancient world, as Cush, the land of gold and abundance. The Bible does not curse Africa. The Bible begins in Africa. The question of why God chose Africa specifically, why the first humans were placed in an African environment and therefore required African bodies, has a theological answer that goes beyond the biological one. Africa is the oldest continent in terms of geological stability. Its ancient rock formations, the Precambrian cratons of sub-Saharan Africa, are among the oldest surface rocks on Earth. Africa sits at the center of the original supercontinent, Pangaea. When the continents broke apart and drifted to their current positions, Africa largely stayed where it was. It is the closest thing the Earth has to an original continent, the piece of ground that has been most continuously where it started. If you were going to choose a location for the origin of humanity on theological grounds, a location that expressed the idea of original, foundational, primordial, Africa is the answer the geology gives you, the same answer the genetics gives you, the same answer the biblical geography gives you. God did not start humanity in a backwater. He started it in the center of the world's most ancient and most biologically diverse continent. Sub-Saharan Africa has more species of plants, animals, insects, and microorganisms than any comparable region on Earth. It has the greatest genetic diversity of any human population on Earth. It has the oldest and most continuous geological record of any continent. If you were designing the cradle of humanity, this is the cradle you would design. And the people who came from that cradle, the people whose bodies were shaped by that environment over hundreds of thousands of years, were dark-complexioned African people. Let's look at what the New Testament adds to this argument, because the story does not end with Genesis. In Acts chapter 17, Paul stands in Athens and addresses the Greek philosophers at the Areopagus. Verse 26 is one of the most important verses in the entire New Testament for understanding the biblical theology of human origins and human equality. From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth. From one man, one origin, one starting point for all of humanity. Every nation, every people group, every ethnicity on earth came from one man. And as we have established, that one man was made from African soil, named after African soil, placed in a garden with African rivers, in an environment that required a dark complexion body to survive. Paul is not teaching biological evolution. He is teaching monotheistic creationism in a Greek context. But the implication of his statement, read against the genetic evidence, is profound. The one man from whom all nations are made was African. The genetic bottleneck that all human populations outside Africa passed through. The single migration event that seeded the entire non-African human population came from an African source. Paul's theological claim and the population geneticist's empirical claim are describing the same reality in different vocabularies. One man. Africa, dark, the rest of human diversity, is variation on that original theme. The depigmentation timeline is worth sitting with, because it shows just how recently pale skin appeared in the human story, and therefore how impossible it is for pale skin to be original. According to genomic studies, The SLC24A5 variant, responsible for a significant portion of the skin lightening seen in European populations, is estimated to have arisen around 6,000 to 12,000 years ago, though some studies push that estimate earlier to around 20,000 to 30,000 years ago for some pigmentation variants. Even at the most generous estimate, human populations with significantly reduced melanin production have only existed for somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 years at most. Homo sapiens has existed for at least 300,000 years, based on the Jebel Irhoud fossils. That means for at least 270,000 of the 300,000 years of human existence, every human being on Earth had dark skin. Pale skin represents less than 10% of total human history, even at the most generous genetic dating. If you compress the entire history of humanity onto a 24-hour clock starting at midnight, pale skin does not appear until around 10:30 in the morning. For the overwhelming majority of human history, from the first breath to almost the middle of the day, every human being looked like an African. Adam and Eve did not merely live in a different era than European Christianity acknowledges. They lived in a time when pale skin literally did not exist anywhere on the planet. Their skin was dark, not as one option among many, but because it was the only option there was. The fossil record makes the same point from the archaeological direction. The oldest anatomically modern human skull ever found is from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, dated to approximately 300,000 years ago. The oldest complete skull with clearly modern morphology is from Omo Kibish in Ethiopia, dated to around 195,000 years ago. The Herto skulls from Ethiopia, dated to around 160,000 years ago, are some of the best preserved early Homo sapien specimens ever found. All of these early humans lived in Africa. All of them lived at latitudes where ultraviolet radiation is intense and where dark skin is biologically necessary. Their descendants, the populations that eventually migrated out of Africa and into Europe and Asia, started dark and only became lighter over tens of thousands of years as the low ultraviolet environments they settled in selected for reduced melanin production. The fossil record is unanimous. The genetic record is unanimous. The biological evidence is unanimous. The first humans were dark. God made them dark because He placed them in Africa. He placed them in Africa because Africa is where He started human history. And He started human history in Africa because Africa is the original, the continent, the ground, the adamah from which Adam came. Augustine of Hippo, the North African theologian whose ideas built half of Western Christianity, as we established in an earlier video in this series, understood the imago Dei, the image of God in humanity, as something expressed through the whole person, body and soul together, not merely through the spiritual or rational dimension of human nature. For Augustine, the human body was not a mistake or a cage or something to be escaped. It was part of the divine image, the material through which God's creativity and rationality and beauty were expressed in creaturely form. If Augustine is right, and the Anglican, Catholic, and Orthodox traditions have all said he is, then the specific body God chose to first express His image in humanity is theologically significant. It was not chosen arbitrarily. God knew what He was doing when He scooped up African soil and shaped it into the first human body. He chose an African body, a dark body, a melanin-rich body, precisely because that body expressed something true about the divine creativity, about the richness and warmth and vitality of the Creator who made it. The first human body was God's first statement about what embodied divine image looks like. He chose dark. He chose African. He chose the body that would stand in the equatorial sun and absorb its energy and survive in the biological abundance of the most ancient and diverse continent on Earth. That choice was not incidental. It was the statement. The paintings that replaced Adam and Eve with white European figures follow the same timeline and the same mechanics as every other whitewashing we have traced in this series. The earliest Christian art, found in the catacombs of Rome from the 2nd and 3rd centuries, depicts Adam and Eve with Mediterranean and Near Eastern features, dark-haired, brown-complexioned, looking like the people of the ancient Near Eastern world where the biblical narrative was produced. As late as the Byzantine period, icons depicting the creation of Adam show figures with the dark features of the Eastern Mediterranean and African traditions that fed Byzantine Christianity. The shift to pale, blonde, European-looking Adam and Eve is a Renaissance phenomenon. The same phenomenon that whitewashed Jesus, Moses, the wise men, and God himself. Michelangelo's famous Sistine Chapel ceiling, completed in 1512, depicts Adam as a muscular, pale, auburn-haired Florentine Renaissance man, reaching his hand toward a white-bearded white god. That image, produced on commission for the most powerful institution in Western Christianity, became the template for every subsequent depiction. 500 years of painting after Michelangelo, in every form from fine art to illustrated children's Bibles to Hollywood films, has been a reproduction of the Sistine template with minor variations. The actual genesis of that template, its actual moment of creation in 1512, aligns perfectly with a century in which the transatlantic slave trade was being established, in which African people were being defined as a lesser category of humanity, for whom enslavement was appropriate, in which the European church was developing the theology of racial hierarchy that required the first humans to be white, so that dark skin could be positioned as later, lesser, derived. The theological stakes of this argument are not abstract. They are immediate and they are personal. If the first humans were black, if Adam and Eve were made from African soil and therefore had the dark complexion that African equatorial soil requires, then every black child alive today is the original image, not the copy, not the variation, not the derived type. The original, the first expression, the first face that God looked at and said it is very good. The psychological weight of that truth, if it were genuinely integrated into black religious identity, rather than systematically suppressed by the European artistic tradition that has dominated global Christianity, would be transformative in exactly the ways that visible representation at the highest levels of power transforms children, which we talked about in the Black President video. When a black child looks at the story of Adam and Eve and sees people who look like them, they are not seeing themselves reflected in the story. They are seeing themselves as the story's origin point. They are the template from which all of humanity was derived. That is not a peripheral claim about representation. That is a claim about the fundamental nature of human dignity and its specific first expression in the material world. God chose a black body for his first statement about what it means to be human. That choice has never been revoked. It was written into the genome of every human being alive, because every human being alive descended from African ancestors who carried that original dark skin as the factory setting of the species. The Kush River in Eden's geography, the Cushite wife of Moses, the African emperors and queens who dominate the early chapters of biblical history, the African setting of every major foundational event, from Eden to the Exodus, to the giving of the law, to the ministry of Jesus himself, form a pattern so consistent that explaining it away requires more intellectual effort than accepting it. The Bible is an African origin story told by Near Eastern people who understood their own connection to Africa, who named the rivers of paradise after African geography, who celebrated Kushite wisdom and Kushite gold, who acknowledged the Egyptian foundations of their own civilization, who preserved in their scriptures the memory that the first man's name meant African soil and the first garden had African rivers. The African origin of humanity is not a reading imposed on the text from outside. It is the reading the text itself produces when you read it with the geographical and linguistic knowledge that its original authors assumed their readers had. The Sunday school version that placed Adam and Eve in a generic neutral paradise that happened to look like a European painting is the imposed reading. It is the reading that requires you to forget that Cush means Africa, that adamah means dark reddish soil, that the Gihon winds through the entire land of Africa, that the genetic ancestors of every human being alive were dark-skinned people in sub-Saharan Africa. What does it mean, finally, that God chose to make the first human beings black? It means that blackness is not a deviation from the human norm. It is the human norm. It means that melanin is not a cosmetic feature. It is original equipment, the biological investment God made in the first human body to protect it in the environment he chose for it. It means that African soil is not peripheral to the biblical story. It is the soil from which the main character of the whole story was shaped. It means that when racists built a theology of black inferiority, they were not just building a bad social theory. They were building directly against the text of the book they claimed to believe, against the genetic record, against the fossil record, against the biology of skin pigmentation, against the geography of Eden, against the name of the first man, against the river that winds through all of Africa in the second chapter of Genesis. They were building a lie so comprehensive and so structurally embedded in European religious art that 2 billion Christians now carry it in their imagination without ever having examined it. And the antidote to that lie is not complicated. It is just reading. Reading Genesis 2 and noticing that adamah means dark soil. Reading Genesis 2 and noticing that one of Eden's rivers winds through Africa. Reading the genetic literature and noticing that mitochondrial Eve was African. Looking at the fossil record and noticing that the oldest human bones are in Ethiopia and Morocco. Looking at the biology of melanin and noticing that dark skin is the original human setting and pale skin is the derived variant. None of this requires a conspiracy theory. None of it requires special revelation. It just requires reading what is actually there, in the scripture and in the science, and being willing to follow it where it leads. God made Adam and Eve black because he made them from African soil, placed them in an African garden, designed their bodies for the African sun, and called what he had made very good. The very good was dark. It has always been dark. And the God who made it that way has never once revised the judgment.